There are people who move through the world like quiet constellations, present, but always just out of reach. They feel deeply, sometimes more than they wish, yet their steps are measured, cautious, almost trained. To others, this distance can look like coldness, disinterest, a closed gate. But underneath it is something far softer, a heart that learned early that closeness can bruise and that longing can wound. So they build spaces around themselves. Not walls exactly, more like gentle, invisible buffers. Enough to feel, but not enough to fall. This is their quiet psychology, a way of loving without being consumed, a way of surviving what once overwhelmed them. This story explores the inner landscape of those who retreat to protect what still aches. There is a kind of distance that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with arguments or walls or dramatic exits. It simply exists, quietly, subtly, woven into the way someone turns their head or takes a breath before answering, or lets silence linger a moment longer than most people expect. You notice it in the way they stand slightly apart in crowded rooms. Never too far, but never close enough to be touched. You see it in their eyes, warm, observant, full of life. And yet, something in them stays beneath the surface, like the soft glow of a lamp covered by a hand. For people who avoid attachment, connection is not a simple instinct. It is a calculation, a balancing act between longing and self-preservation. Every step toward intimacy is measured. Every gesture of openness is considered. Their hearts move like cautious explorers, advancing only after scanning for the faintest sign of danger. And danger, for them, is not chaos or conflict. Danger is hope. Danger is closeness. Danger is the possibility of being seen so clearly that their secret vulnerabilities have nowhere left to hide. Many of them learned long ago that attachment is a place where the ground can shift without warning. Love, to them, is a door that can close mid-step. Trust is a rope that can break even when held carefully. So they built a softer kind of protection, not emotional numbness, not coldness, but something quieter, a gentle retreat. To others, this retreat can look confusing. It shows up as mixed signals, slow responses, or vanishing acts during moments of emotional intensity. Not because they don't care, but because caring wakes the fear they worked so hard to quiet. Their avoidance is not rejection. It is maintenance of an internal equilibrium that feels necessary for survival. They keep people just far enough away to avoid being hurt, but close enough not to feel alone. A delicate choreography, a private language of careful boundaries. And yet, beneath this distance lies a longing they rarely admit, to be understood without pressure, to be loved without demand, to be held in a way that doesn't threaten the fragile scaffolding they've constructed around their hearts. But longing is risky. It stirs old memories, old losses, the echoes of times when closeness was met with confusion or disappointment. So they become experts at subtle exit routes, a shift in tone, a retreat into silence, a polite change of subject. They withdraw not out of malice, but instinct, an emotional reflex shaped years before adulthood gave them words to explain it. For the avoidant heart, intimacy feels like standing at the edge of deep water. Part of them wants to step in, to feel the warmth, the closeness, the shared gravity of human connection. But another part remembers what it felt like to be overwhelmed, unprepared, unprotected. And so they hold on to the shore, even as their chest aches with the quiet desire to swim. People often misunderstand this. They see the restraint, but not the wounds. They see the calm, but not the fear. They see the distance, but not the tenderness that lives behind it, waiting for a moment that feels safe enough to emerge. This chapter is the beginning of their emotional landscape, the recognition that these individuals are not cold or detached by nature. They are simply people who learned to tread lightly around attachment, because attachment once felt like a place where their feelings were too heavy or their needs too invisible. Their distance is not a rejection of connection. It is a mourning of what connection once cost them. Here, in this familiar distance, is where the story begins. With a heart that wants to be close, but remembers too clearly how closeness can burn. There is always an origin, a moment or a series of moments when connection stopped feeling safe and began to feel uncertain. For people who avoid attachment, this shift rarely happens in adulthood. Its roots reach much deeper, into childhood memories where emotions were held too tightly or not held at all. Sometimes it begins with a parent who was physically present but emotionally distant. Someone who offered shelter, food, structure, everything except consistent warmth. A guardian who loved in the only way they knew how, but whose own fears or stresses made closeness unpredictable. The child learned to read the subtle signals, the tone of a voice, the slump of shoulders, the silence that stretched too long. They adjusted themselves to avoid overwhelming the adult they depended on. Other times, the origins are quieter. Not an obvious neglect, but a steady pattern of emotional missing. A parent who hugged but didn't listen, who provided but didn't ask how the child felt, who praised achievements more easily than they acknowledged pain. In these households, love was available, just not reliably in the form the child needed. So the child learned a simple truth: expressing needs can lead to disappointment. There are also childhoods shaped by inconsistency, a caretaker who was warm one day and withdrawn the next, a place where affection depended on mood, stress, or circumstance. Here, love became conditional, unpredictable, sometimes comforting, sometimes sharp. And so the child learned that attachment is not a steady light, but a flickering one. They learned to self-soothe, to hide their needs, to become small in moments of emotional intensity. Some children grew up being the strong one, the reliable one, the one praised for independence, for handling things alone, for never causing trouble. Adults called it maturity. But beneath that praise was a burden, being emotionally self-sufficient long before their heart was ready. What looked like confidence was often defense. A tiny person learning not to rely on others because relying once led to confusion or letdowns. There are children who witnessed conflict, the kind that echoed through walls or lived in unspoken tension. They learned that closeness can turn into chaos without warning, that vulnerability invites unpredictability. They survived by monitoring everything: the temperature of the room, the sharpness in voices, the pauses between breaths. When you grow up navigating tension, distance becomes a form of safety. And there are those whose early heartbreak came not from family at all, but from peers. A friend who betrayed a confidence, a first love that arrived too intensely and left too soon. A moment when the world showed them that attachment can break things inside you. After that, their heart learned to hold back, not to stop feeling, but to prevent feeling too much. Regardless of the specific story, the emotional lesson is the same. Closeness carries risk. Distance carries relief. Childhood is where this belief first takes shape. Not through dramatic events alone, but through small, repeated patterns that taught the developing brain to associate connection with vigilance, rather than relaxation. And the child who internalized this grows into an adult who moves carefully, an adult who feels safest when emotions are contained, controlled, predictable, an adult whose independence was once survival, not preference. They no longer remember the exact moment the fear of attachment began. They remember only how it felt, the sting of a need unmet, the quiet ache of wanting more, the confusion of being told to speak while feeling unheard. And so they unconsciously built a life where needing less felt easier than asking for more. The origins of avoidance are never signs of weakness. They are evidence of how deeply a child once cared and how deeply that caring went unanswered. This is where the protective instinct was born. In rooms where emotions felt too loud, in hands that held but didn't reassure, in hearts that learned early that distance could stop the hurting. There is a quiet science behind the instinct to pull away. A physiology, a blueprint the body follows long before the mind finds language to explain it. Avoidant attachment does not arise from the indifference. It grows from adaptation. The nervous system learns patterns the same way it learns to walk or breathe. Through repetition, through experience, through the emotional climate of early life. To understand avoidance, one must first understand the brain's most ancient priority: safety. People often imagine safety as physical protection, locked doors, steady homes, predictable routines. But even more essential is emotional safety. The assurance that one's inner world will be met with warmth, acceptance, and consistency. When a child repeatedly reaches for comfort and finds unpredictability instead, when affection is inconsistent, or emotions are dismissed, or vulnerability leads to tension, their nervous system begins to adapt. It learns that reaching out is risky. It learns that minimizing needs keeps pain at bay. This adaptation becomes the foundation of what psychologists call avoidant attachment. In the brain, this pattern is supported by several mechanisms. 1. Emotional downregulation. Avoidant individuals become skilled at dampening emotional arousal. They unconsciously suppress feelings, not because they don't have them, but because expressing them once led to disappointment. The brain reduces the activation of areas related to emotional expression and leans heavily on cognitive control. Thinking becomes safer than feeling. 2. Hyperactivation of self-reliance. Over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned to rely on the self rather than others. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning and self-regulation, takes on the role that supportive caregivers once should have played. Independence becomes not a skill, but a shield. 3. The deactivation strategy. Attachment theory describes deactivation as the subtle process of turning down emotional impulses that might lead to closeness. When someone gets too near, the brain creates distance. Memories of independence arise, flaws in the other person become more visible, or a sense of suffocation appears. These reactions are not conscious choices. They are protective reflexes embedded deep within attachment circuitry. 4. Avoidance of vulnerability. Triggers for an avoidant heart. Certain experiences activate the old fear network, being needed too intensely, emotional scrutiny, reminders of past hurt, or even unexpected kindness. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, quietly flags intimacy as a potential threat, not because closeness is dangerous itself, but because it once correlated with pain. 5. Reward system recalibration. Interestingly, avoidant individuals do not lack desire for connection. Their brain's reward system lights up at the idea of companionship, touch, or trust. But the fear circuitry competes with the reward circuitry, and fear often wins, not loudly but subtly, through discomfort, hesitation, or retreat. This is why avoidant individuals often feel misunderstood. The outside world sees restraint. Inside, there is a complex neurological dance, carefully choreographed to avoid overwhelming the nervous system with unpredictable emotions. They are not incapable of love. They are not detached by nature. They are simply wired to maintain emotional autonomy because autonomy once kept them safe. Modern science does not pathologize avoidance. It recognizes it as an adaptive strategy, a way the brain protected a child from emotional disorientation. What was once survival becomes habit, then identity. But science also offers hope. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire, means that old patterns can soften. With safety, consistency, and time, the nervous system can learn new pathways. Attachment can become less threatening, less consuming, less tied to memories of instability. Behind every avoidant pattern is a brain that tried its best to protect a tender heart. A heart that still feels deeply, even if it shows it rarely. A heart shaped not by coldness, but by caution. This is the physiological truth. Avoidance is not an absence of emotion. It is the body's silent attempt to guard it. Inside the avoidant heart lives a war no one else can see. A war between longing and fear, closeness and retreat, hope and self-protection. It is not dramatic. It happens quietly, beneath the surface, in moments that seem ordinary to an outside observer. It begins with a spark, a connection that feels warm, a conversation that feels sincere, a presence that makes the body exhale in an unfamiliar way. Part of them leans in instinctively. Part of them softens without meaning to. But with that softening comes unease. Affection awakens old reflexes. Safety feels suspicious precisely because it is rare. And so the conflict begins. The avoidant heart desires intimacy, not the loud, all-consuming kind, but the gentle assurance of being understood. Yet the moment someone gets close enough to see their real emotional landscape, a silent alarm begins to ring. It sounds like a tightening in the chest, a sudden need for space, a shift from warm curiosity to distant observation. They withdraw not to punish, but to breathe, not to reject, but to recalibrate. For them, closeness feels like deep water, inviting, yet unpredictable. Every step toward it triggers memories of times when vulnerability was met with confusion, disappointment, or silence. Their body remembers the letdowns even when their mind has long forgotten the details. So they alternate between warmth and distance. They reach out and retreat. They open up, then close again. They want connection, but fear its consequences. This push and pull is often misunderstood by partners, friends, or even by themselves. They may ask, "Why do I feel this way? Why do I want someone until they want me back? Why does closeness make me anxious when I crave it the most?" The answer lies in the emotional contradictions they carry. They love without leaning. They care without claiming. They feel deeply without showing it. And deep down, they fear that if someone sees how much they truly feel, they will either be overwhelmed or leave. This internal conflict creates patterns, sleeping better alone, keeping emotional conversations short, preferring independence even when loneliness lingers. They may choose people who are unavailable because it feels safer, or they may stay silent during conflict because silence once protected them. But in private, they carry guilt. Guilt for withdrawing, guilt for wanting space, guilt for not being able to respond with the same emotional intensity others expect. They wish they could explain that their distance is not a lack of love. It is the only way they know how to stay without losing themselves. Their resistance is not defiance. It is fear dressed as self-preservation. And yet, there are moments, small, delicate moments, when their defenses soften. A question asked gently. A presence that does not push. A silence that feels safe instead of suffocating. In those moments, their longing becomes visible. The war quiets. The distance shrinks, but it never disappears completely. Avoidance is not a switch. It is a spectrum, a constant negotiation between past wounds and present desires. The avoidant heart walks through life carrying two truths. I do not want to be hurt again, and I wish someone would stay anyway. This chapter is the landscape of that conflict, the emotional battlefield where wanting meets withdrawing, where fear meets tenderness, and where the heart learns to protect itself even as it yearns for connection. Transformation for avoidant individuals rarely happens in sweeping revelations. It happens in quiet, almost unnoticed shifts, moments that gently challenge the belief that closeness is unsafe. It begins with a presence, not necessarily a romantic one. A friend, a partner, a mentor, sometimes even a stranger whose calmness softens the instinct to retreat. This person doesn't demand intimacy. They don't push for confessions or chase emotional depth. They simply remain steady, consistent in a way the avoidant nervous system is not used to. Safety, for them, is not built through intensity, but through predictability. At first, the avoidant heart resists. Old reflexes activate. A familiar voice whispers inside them, "Don't trust this. Don't open too much. Don't rely on anyone." But the steadiness continues, and something inside them begins to thaw. The turning point is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it's a conversation that feels unexpectedly easy. Sometimes it's a moment of vulnerability that slips out before they can stop it. A truth spoken softly. A fear admitted quietly. Sometimes it's simply the experience of being around someone who doesn't pull away when they do. What breaks through is not a person, but a feeling. A small, fragile recognition that closeness doesn't always bring pain. That vulnerability can exist without punishment. That someone can stay without suffocating them. The realization unfolds slowly. My distance isn't protecting me the way it used to. I'm lonely in ways I didn't want to admit. I want connection, even if it scares me. This realization is bittersweet. It brings hope, but also grief. Grief for the years spent behind emotional glass, for the relationships that never deepened, for the parts of themselves they silenced to stay safe. The turning point also reveals something they rarely expressed. Their avoidance was never about keeping people out. It was about keeping themselves intact. When someone finally feels safe enough, the avoidant heart begins to offer small openings, tiny acts of trust, short moments of emotional presence. They might share a personal story. They might ask for help in a quiet voice. They might lean into a conversation instead of ending it early. And though these gestures look small, they are monumental from the inside. Closeness starts to feel less like a threat and more like a possibility. But the turning point is not a cure. Fear remains. Old habits linger. They still retreat when overwhelmed, still go silent when confronted, still need space to breathe. The difference is that now they return more willingly. The space they take is not an escape. It is a pause. A moment to regulate instead of disconnect. A moment to remind themselves, this closeness is new, but it is not dangerous. The turning point is not about changing who they are. It is about realizing they no longer have to protect themselves from everyone. It marks the beginning of a new internal narrative, one where safety and closeness can coexist, one where attachments do not feel like traps, one where tenderness can be received instead of deflected. In this chapter, something softens, something shifts, something in them whispers for the first time in years. My healing for the avoidant heart is a quiet process, not a leap, but a series of small, deliberate steps. Not an explosion of emotion, but a gradual loosening of the internal grip that once kept everything tightly contained. It begins with allowing someone to see the tiredness behind their eyes, allowing conversations to last a little longer than comfort permits, allowing themselves to be cared for in ways they once rejected instinctively. Healing is not about abandoning independence. It is about discovering that independence and connection can coexist, that strength does not require solitude. They start to practice staying, not because they feel pressure, but because something inside them has softened enough to try. Staying in a moment of discomfort, staying through a difficult discussion, staying present even when their instinct says to shut down. At first, these attempts feel unnatural. Their body tenses, their chest tightens. Old fears whisper reminders of past disappointments, but they do not run, not immediately. They linger, even if just a breath longer than before. Healing also means understanding their patterns without shame, recognizing that avoidance was once protection, not failure. Seeing the younger self who once withdrew to survive, and meeting that version of themselves with compassion. They begin to rewrite what connection means. Connection becomes something slow, steady, and gentle. Not an overwhelming force, but a soft presence they can approach on their own terms. They learn that space does not have to equal distance, and distance does not have to equal abandonment. The people who support them in healing are those who understand the rhythm of their heart, who know that silence is not rejection, who recognize that retreat is a pause, who make room for both closeness and breathing. These relationships become the soil where new patterns grow. Micro moments of trust lead to deeper roots, sharing emotions that once felt dangerous, letting someone comfort them, saying, "I was hurt," instead of hiding behind stoicism. Healing is not perfection. Even as they grow, they still stumble. They still withdraw on difficult days. They still feel overwhelmed when emotions run high. But now, they return more quickly. Their distance shortens. Their openness widens. Their desire to stay begins to outweigh their instinct to run. Integration is the process of letting old wounds coexist with new truths. I was hurt before. Connection felt unsafe. But I am learning something different now. The avoidant heart discovers that being known is not a loss of control. It is a quiet acceptance that someone can hold space for their inner world without demanding to possess it. Healing does not erase fear. It teaches them how to move with it, softly, patiently, with an understanding that hearts, even guarded ones, are capable of change. And in this soft change, they become more themselves, not the version shaped by survival, but the version shaped by choice. I don't have to walk through life alone. There comes a moment, often unremarkable, almost imperceptible, when the avoidant heart realizes how far it has traveled. Not away from people, but toward life. This realization does not look like grand transformation. It looks like a quiet morning where their chest feels lighter. A conversation where they speak without rehearsing. A connection that feels gentle instead of threatening. It looks like stillness. And in that stillness, they recognize something profound. Their distance was never a flaw. It was a story, a map of places where their heart had been bruised and the routes it took to protect itself. They begin to see the humanity in their own patterns, the way fear shaped their strength, the way caution shaped their sensitivity, the way independence grew from necessity, but still carried beauty. Avoidant individuals are not broken. They are simply tender in ways the world rarely understands. This closing chapter is not about declaring victory over avoidance. It is about acknowledging the quiet courage it takes to live with a guarded heart, and the even quieter courage it takes to let that guard soften. Healing is not the end of fear. It is the beginning of gentleness. A gentleness toward themselves, toward the child who longed for steadiness, toward the teenager who pretended not to care, toward the adult who navigated intimacy cautiously because no one taught them how to feel safe in it. They learn that tenderness does not have to overwhelm, that connection does not have to consume, that they can offer love in small, meaningful ways without losing themselves. And in these realizations, something beautiful unfolds. A sense of permission. Permission to feel. Permission to need. Permission to stay. The avoidant heart will always move at its own pace. Slow, deliberate, gentle. But the pace is not the point. The direction is. There is no pressure here. No demand to open quickly or trust fully. Just a quiet encouragement for them to inhabit their humanity without apology. Because underneath every instinct to withdraw is a desire to be held carefully. Underneath every hesitation is a wish to be understood. And underneath every protective layer is a heart that has always been capable of love. Love that is soft, steady, and profoundly real. As this story closes, the message lingers softly. You do not need to be unguarded to be worthy. You do not need to be fearless to be loved. You simply need to let your heart exist. As it is, as it feels, imperfect and human and learning. In the quiet space between avoidance and belonging lives a truth often forgotten. Even guarded hearts still long for closeness. Even cautious souls still whisper for connection. Even those who fear attachment still carry the capacity to love, deeply and sincerely. This is their whisper, their journey, their quiet reclamation. A reminder that even the softest steps toward closeness are steps toward life.